History as it happens, September 20th, 2022. The Queen's Empire.
Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has died. Queen Elizabeth was the longest-serving monarch.
Queen died peacefully, the royal family says, at Balmoral this
afternoon.
afternoon.
Let us give thanks for Queen Elizabeth's commitment to the Commonwealth throughout her reign, for her service and dedication to its people, and for the rich...
Rarely has such a promise been so well kept. Few leaders receive the outpouring of love that we have seen.
On the other hand, you're also aware, you're taught in school, you learn on your own a little bit more about the sort of darker history. The British Empire was part of the greatest colonial experiment the world has ever known.
Queen Elizabeth's reign bridged historical eras. She ascended soon after the British Empire began its bloody disintegration, and she remained queen long after the formal empire was swept into the dustbin of history. But the legacy of colonialism still stings, and that's why some are not feeling any nostalgia for the old world Elizabeth left behind. That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Your Congress and our Parliament are the twin pillars of our civilizations and the chief among the many treasures that we have inherited from our predecessors.
She was head of state, and as head of state, she was the symbol of Britain and Britain's imperial possessions.
Thousands of Jamaicans give a warm welcome to Her Majesty the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh.
1953, the year of her coronation. Young Queen Elizabeth showered with cheers from Her Majesty's subjects.
By a statue of Rodney, whose naval victories rid Jamaica of the threat of French invasion in the late 18th century.
This British Pathé video opens a window into a bygone era. Jamaica would gain its independence 9 years later.
Jamaica was the happiest island in all the Caribbean. Kingston was in holiday mood, and the whole population hung out the flags.
And by the end of the 1960s, the British Empire was pretty much gone. But it left a mark. How could it not? Colonialism was a bloody, nasty business of brute force and economic exploitation. And as the mixed reaction to Elizabeth's death shows, the scar hasn't fully healed. Not because Elizabeth II was another King Leopold. She was a ceremonial figure who inherited a global empire whose disintegration was underway. Because she was a symbol of that empire. If she was an anchor of her nation's identity, as one writer put it, if she was the personification of grace and stability, she was also a symbol of colonialism, her face adorning British currency changing hands all over her empire. Here is a headline from the BBC. Queen Elizabeth's death leads to renewed African calls for apologies. From the Washington Post, in former British colonies, ghosts of past haunt mourning for the Queen. If now is not the time to reckon with this history, a history some are clearly still uncomfortable discussing, then when? Historian Dane Kennedy is Professor Emeritus at George Washington University. He is the author of many books on the British Empire and colonialism, including The Imperial History Wars, Debating the British Empire, published in 2018, and Decolonization, a very short introduction, published in 2016. Dane Kennedy, welcome.
Thank you, Martin.
Welcome to the studio. I'm trying to get more of my guests to come on in, you know?
Well, they should. This is an interesting place.
Anyway, let's dive into the subject matter here. I'm just curious, what have you been thinking about as a specialist in the history of the British Empire since the Queen died?
What has interested me is actually how much attention, especially in the American press, there has been about the legacy of the Queen in relation to the empire. A number of stories and op-eds and so on that have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and a variety of other venues that have addressed this issue, which I find really appropriate and a pleasure.
If now is not the time to discuss this issue, when?
Exactly.
Right? Some people find it distasteful, but I don't understand why we can't take somebody's entire legacy, right? Their life and times into account and reflect on it, right? I mean, she was an important figure for a reason, not just because she wore fancy clothes and, whatever, right?
Right. She was head of state, and as head of state, she was the symbol of Britain and Britain's imperial possessions.
So let's start with a wide lens then. The global atmosphere after the Second World War, the UN Charter establishing the idea of universal human rights. How did that help give rise to the independence movements, not just in the British Empire, but in all the other empires?
The UN Declaration of Human Rights is certainly an important monument in the development of a growing international consensus that all peoples should have the right to determine their own political futures. And in that respect, it's something that everyone took notice of, I think. We shouldn't exaggerate its importance, however. Certainly those groups of colonial peoples that were struggling for independence, they'd been doing so before the UN Declaration. The UN Declaration didn't change their views one iota. And by the same token, I think it's interesting that Britain itself was a signatory to this declaration. And it was a signatory precisely because the language was ambiguous enough that it didn't regard this declaration as a threat to its claims of colonial sovereignty.
That's interesting. Similar to the Soviet Union and the Helsinki Final Act, right? A generation later.
Yeah.
The British had no intention of getting rid of their empire after the war, right?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. If anything, after the war, there was a resurgence of imperial ambition, if you would.
But the country was exhausted by the war. I mean, what they wanted and what they were able to achieve, those are two different things.
Yes, they were. But this is, in fact, the exhaustion and the economic cost of the war figured into their decision to try to rebuild and maintain the empire because they saw it as a vehicle for actually strengthening their own economy.
So back to the idea of imperialist rule. It was based on the doctrine of racial supremacy. Why did that idea, I mentioned the UN Charter before, but why did this idea lose its legitimacy after the Second World War?
One word, Hitler. Hitler took the ideas of racial supremacy, which had been deployed overseas and used to justify the colonial conquest and subjugation of non-white peoples in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, and applied it in Europe itself and used exactly the same rationale to justify the conquest of Eastern Europe and to dismiss Jews and Slavs and Romas and other peoples as racial inferiors, and then go further and exterminate many of them.
Hitler did not invent concentration camps, is what you're saying. I think he was inspired by treatment of Native Americans in North America, putting them on reservations, and also how European powers had treated subject peoples in Africa and elsewhere.
He was very much aware of what the Americans and the British had done in their past and their history. And he looked in particular to the British Empire as a kind of model for what he wanted to achieve.
So Elizabeth II becomes queen in 1952. Her father, King George VI, dies, and she is coronated the next year, 1953. So for folks who might be a little unfamiliar with this chapter of history, what was the state of the British Empire in 1952? It was still mostly intact, right?
Yeah, I think the clearest distinction to draw is between what happened to the empire in Asia and what the status of it was elsewhere around the world. Of course, Britain had a global empire, one on which the sun never set, as the saying goes. But in Asia, the war against Japan had shattered British rule and British prestige. Of course, the Japanese had invaded Hong Kong and Singapore and Malaya and Borneo and Burma, now Myanmar, and was knocking on the doors of India itself. Now, there had already been a long and powerful independence struggle in India, but this was, in many respects, the culminating blow for the British in their power in that part of the world.
Yeah, so their rule had already been, if not undermined, vanquished.
It had. I mean, even during the Second World War, Churchill sent emissary to negotiate with the nationalists And that emissary made it clear, look, we understand, independence is around the corner, but help us out now.
Well, the Japanese invaded India in 1944 as well. That invasion did not go well for them. And you mentioned Churchill. That was this queen's first prime minister.
Yeah, absolutely.
India and Pakistan, they had already won their independence, right? 1947.
Yes.
And Britain had retreated from its mandate in Palestine in 1947. You just talked about how decolonization had kind of gotten a head start or a jump start in parts of Asia. Mm-hmm. How far along was it in other parts of the empire at this point?
Well, there were certainly nationalist movements in a variety of parts of the empire, in much of Africa and part of the Caribbean and the like. But I think we need to distinguish between what was going on the ground and what the British themselves thought was a threat. And I think in the early 1950s, the view still was that their control of these territories was solid. It's also worth recalling that Queen Elizabeth learned that she was queen when she was in Kenya on safari, touring Africa.
I've seen some of these photos. I mean, they really are from a bygone era. The queen in her beautiful wardrobe walking past native peoples as if they're, I don't know, help me out here.
Well, I think what the image you see is the image, and it was a deliberate attempt on the part of the British, of a kind of National Geographic view of Africa.
Yes,
Africans,
that's it.
Right? Sort of tribal peoples who were living in the past, and who required, therefore, the benevolent oversight of the British, and in particular, a queen.
So we're talking about 50 countries in all were in the British Empire around this time, and we already said India, Pakistan had gone their own way, but roughly 50?
About that, I think.
Yes, that's a large empire. So, main order of business here, what role, if any, did the young queen play in all of this? Because, I've been reading all the op-eds that you mentioned and the think pieces and the historical pieces. And it's hard to find anyone blaming her for imperialism. It's more about what she symbolized. Right. So do we know her views on decolonization? Did she want to preserve the empire?
No, we don't really know her views. I mean, this was part of her skill as a constitutional monarch who understood that her role was symbolic, not instrumental. She did not take part in policy. She was informed about the policies of each government that came to power. Privately, she probably did express her views to the prime ministers when they came for their weekly consultations with her. But those views were kept entirely confidential, and there's no evidence that they had any real effect on British policy. So she was a symbolic head of state.
Powerful symbol, though.
Extremely powerful, and that was reinforced by the way in which she and her children were continually touring around the empire. That was how she played an important role in trying to maintain the authority, the prestige of the British presence.
Because some of these nation states then joined what was called the Commonwealth. So
yes.
they won their independence in sometimes appallingly bloody wars of national liberation. I mean, India was left a mess by the British. And the partition with Pakistan, about 1 million people killed? But they did then join the Commonwealth.
Yes.
Explain why that was.
Well, I mean, certainly there was a good deal of pressure by the British for them to do this. And the negotiations are interesting because the Commonwealth had been established earlier in the 20th century as effectively a union of white settler colonies, or what came to be known as dominions: Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa to some degree. And they were constitutionally, there was a Statute of Westminster that was created in 1931 that said, okay, we're a free and equal union of peoples as a commonwealth, but we share recognition of the Queen as our sovereign. So that was the one critical link that bound them together apart from heritage, from history. So when the post-war period comes and the British are pressing the Indians and the Pakistanis and others to join, they became republics. And they said, well, yeah, we'll join, but we will not recognize the Queen as our sovereign. And if you look at the Commonwealth today, the vast majority of states that are members of the Commonwealth of Nations do not recognize the Queen as sovereign. They are republics. But they joined. They joined because they too saw some self-interest in this. This was an organization that would offer some kind of potential common defense, some economic assistance, and the like.
So end of World War II, we mentioned how the British government really did not want to let go of its colonial possessions. And the Queen, we really don't know how she felt about some of these things. But soon it became inevitable, right, for a number of powerful reasons. Exhaustion after fighting World War II. What were some of the other? What about the cost of empire, maintaining?
Yeah, that's an issue that historians have struggled to really give any kind of effective answer to. We do not really know. I mean, there are those who see the empire as beneficial financially to Britain, and those who argue that it was in fact a drain on British resources.
But at the time, there was a sense that maintaining these soldiers all over the world was an expense they couldn't have anymore.
Well, that's interesting because immediately after the Second World War, the Labour government in 1948 instituted national service, which was a draft. Now, the British had always had a volunteer army, and the only times they had a draft was during the First and the Second World Wars. So here they institute this in the aftermath of the Second World War, which speaks to me to a determination not only to hold on to the empire, but to view the costs that were attached to it at a time when Britain is suffering enormous financial pain, that it's worth it.
Really, the most important factor was the power of the independence movements.
Again, this is a subject of enormous debate. That was an enormously important force. I think we also have to look at the ways in which the global economy is shifting in the post-war period, and particularly by the late 50s and early 60s, and a growing, I think, sense that maybe the empire simply doesn't have the kind of value it had before.
And there were different approaches in different parts of the world. I should point that out, right? I mean, why does the British government retreat from Palestine?
Well, in Palestine, I mean, they were confronted by a terrible civil war between Jews and Arabs that they had caused, frankly, with the Balfour Declaration by offering it as a homeland for Jews, but then had found no way of reconciling the very competing interests of the indigenous Palestinian population and the Jewish immigrants. And so that problem was simply magnified by the Second World War and by the influx of refugees, Jewish refugees. They made various attempts to resolve the problem by proposing partition, which interestingly enough was the same solution they offered for British India, dividing it between India and Pakistan, and which they did in 1920 in Ireland as well, which was perhaps the earliest case of decolonization of a part of the empire.
So on this point about how the British Empire or how the British government handled decolonization in different parts of the world, I'll read from Ian Kershaw's The Global Age, Europe 1950 to 2017, which is a marvelous overview of that continent's history. Britain's withdrawal from India and Palestine did not signal a swift end to its other overseas possessions. British forces held back for the time being a nationalist movement in Malaya, a region with precious dollar-earning rubber resources, through the imposition of a state of emergency in June 1948 and the deployment of military power against insurgent communists. So before I go further here in Kershaw, what happened there? I mean, we were just talking about exhaustion. They had just fought a war against the Nazis, and here they are sending soldiers into Asia again.
Yeah, Malaya was one of the few places in Asia where they were determined to hold on if they possibly could. And the reason is because of its enormous value to them as a source of tin and rubber. Also because in Malaysia, or Malaya as it was then known, there was really not any sustained nationalist movement. But one of the things that the Japanese occupation did was stimulate a resistance movement, particularly among the Chinese population that was resident in Malaya. And it was that Chinese population which was very successful in helping to drive the Japanese out And the leader of that resistance was a man who was then awarded Order of the British Empire, I think it was, by the British government. He then became the leader of the resistance to British rule.
They're only your enemy once they start pointing their guns in the wrong direction. So, you mentioned before about the costs of colonialism versus the profits that you can extract and, on the balance sheet, which one comes out ahead. Couldn't the British get tin and rubber from Malaya without holding it as a colonial possession?
They could, but this is part of a more complex international economic system. They are deeply indebted to the United States, and they desperately need dollars. And they have created a currency zone, the sterling area, in which Malaya, for example, sells tin and rubber on the international market in dollars, but then that is converted into pound sterling. So it is a vehicle for the British to maintain their financial stability as well as to acquire these resources.
One more country, because if we cover we'll be here for 4 hours, because I do want to return to the symbolism of the Queen and the Empire and the debate that's happening today. But I think this is helpful because if we're going to talk about the Queen as a symbol of imperialism, we need to talk about this history that has people holding fraught conversations online, among other places. So more Kershaw here. And they were engaged in Kenya between 1952 and 56 in the brutal repression in which thousands were killed of the vicious Mau Mau, whose anti-colonial struggle involved terrible atrocities. The dam walls of colonialism were yet to burst, however, they were soon to do so. And curiously, what brought the surge that finally swept away Britain's former colonies took place in a country that was already independent and had never formally been part of the empire, Egypt.
Right. So there was the so-called emergency. And I should point out language is important here, too. The British called it the Kenyan Emergency, not a war. Because if they declared that it was a war, in fact, it was subject to international oversight. And because it was an emergency, they could act in a way that has often been described as a dirty war. So that involved mass detention of people who they feared were rebels, use of torture, convictions without trial.
All that happened.
All of that happened in Kenya. And roughly 1 million Kenyans, mainly of the Kikuyu tribe, were placed in relocation camps, protected villages as they were called, and several 100,000 were placed in effect prisons, open-air prisons where there were multiple abuses, people died, and ultimately, and this is how this story has come to continue to haunt the British, 4 of those now very elderly detainees sued the British government in 2012 for damages for torture. And they won.
$20 million or 20 million pounds, $20 million.
Pounds, yes.
Okay.
For them and also for there were several hundred others who were identified who had survived.
What was British public opinion back home about all these horrible wars and the dismantling of the empire?
There is a growing sense of concern among some elements of the British public, especially on the left. There were critics in the Labour Party and in the socialist fringe who said this is not appropriate, this shouldn't happen. But for the most part, I think, the British public was focused on domestic concerns.
I mean, they took a long time for the British to recover from the Second World War. I mean, there was still rubble in the streets for years afterwards.
There certainly was.
An experience that Americans could not relate to. Right. So we don't have to go over the entire history of the Suez Crisis here, 1956, but long story short, Britain, France, and Israel collude to invade Egypt, I guess the Sinai Peninsula, because Nasser had nationalized the Suez Canal.
The British actually reoccupied the Suez Canal.
Reoccupied the Suez Canal zone, right. And this was like a last gasp of imperialism straight out of the 19th century. Never told the United States. Eisenhower was utterly furious.
Yes.
And it was like gunboat diplomacy all over again. And it failed miserably. And as I mentioned, Kershaw says this was kind of the final push for the rest of these places to go their own way. What do you think of that?
I think that played a really important role. And what's especially significant about the Suez Crisis is that Britain was forced to back down forced into a humiliating retreat, not by the Egyptians, but by the Americans. And it was the financial crisis that accompanied this invasion and the desperate need by the British to get financial assistance from the United States to stabilize their currency that really was the blow that forced them to back down. And in the aftermath of that, in the aftermath of the Suez Crisis, I think what became clear to the British was the Americans were now the top dogs and that they could not act independently in international affairs, certainly not in this manner, and antagonize the Americans in the way that they had.
Because the United States was an anti-colonial empire, if we want to use that word. We'll return to the issue of empire in the United States later. But we were not big fans of colonialism. At least FDR was not.
He was not.
So after that, I'll just name a few more countries that went their own way. Sudan, January 1956, preceding Suez. Ghana, formerly known as the Gold Coast, gained its independence March 1957. Malaya, that we mentioned, July 57. Cyprus, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Zanzibar, Uganda, Kenya, Northern Rhodesia, Malta, Singapore, Gambia. I mean, there's a lot of countries here, all in a short period of time. Yes. And that's basically it.
Yes.
That's it.
By the mid-1960s, the British Empire is, for all intents and purposes, done.
And all the European empires, with the exception of Portugal's strange empire, what they had left of it down in Africa with Angola.
Right.
Well, I think that was the 1970s,
yes.
Finally. So I mentioned about how this history is causing a lot of consternation. I'll read you an excerpt from a Washington Post piece. This was a reported piece, not an op-ed. Online and in private, there have been fraught discussions about the extent to which Queen Elizabeth, whose duties were largely ceremonial, bore responsibility in how to balance respect for the dead with reckoning of past wrongs. And here's the key quote. The thing I think Western people need to generally try to absorb and realize is that colonialism is history in the West, said Saifo Halongwene, a writer based in Johannesburg. It's a thing of the past in the West, but in our countries, colonialism is now.
Yeah, that's a great quote. I think that speaks to the feelings of very large numbers of people in ex-colonial countries around the world. You look at what happened when members of the royal family visited in the Caribbean, for example, and the rather hostile response they received in the last year.
Not because they did anything, right?
Right. No.
Those individuals, right? But what they represent. So what does that mean, colonialism is now? One thing I've learned from doing my podcast is to look at events, not only as events, but as processes that continue to play out and ripple across decades. So this fellow who was quoted in the Post article said, in South Africa, many apartheid-era practices were borrowed from the British. Poverty today has largely broken down along racial lines. The British and their descendants still control the vast majority of the country's lucrative mines. So the empire is gone, but its residual effects are still there, and probably not just in South Africa.
Well, I think one of the ways to think about this is to consider simply the territorial character of the new states that came into being. They were all constituted around the territorial boundaries that had been created by colonialism itself, and were not reflective of the pre-existing ethnic divisions and alliances that may have existed in those places. So you look at the map of Africa today, or the map of India, or most anywhere else, and you are confronted with the colonial heritage. It's there. It's staring you in the face.
Look at the Middle East. There was no nation-state of Iraq until some British and French dudes decided to create one when they were carving up their mandates, right?
Yeah.
So a line from that Post article that I mentioned, the Queen, whose duties were largely ceremonial, the extent to which she bore responsibility. We mentioned this before. I mean, it's really hard to say if she had any responsibility for what was going on here at all.
She does not bear any kind of legal responsibility. I mean, she did not institute policy. The argument could be made that she bears some moral responsibility because she actively supported and defended and represented the empire.
And did she educate her subjects, I guess we'll call them subjects, about this history? Did she use her megaphone, her platform, to kind of initiate a public reckoning with these horrible chapters?
No, she didn't. That was not her role. And so I don't think she should be faulted for not having done so.
Because I think some people are.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah,
So I'd like for your thoughts on this as well. An op-ed in the New York Times by Hari Kunzru, who said his father's side was made up of staunch Indian nationalists who worked for the end of imperial rule in 1947. He said the Queen bridged the colonial and post-colonial eras, but for those of us who have a complicated relationship to Britain's imperial past, the continuity represented by Elizabeth was not an unmitigated good. He says she was queen when British officers tortured Kenyans during the Mau Mau uprising, as we discussed. She was queen when troops fired on civilians in Northern Ireland. She spent a lifetime smiling and waving at cheering native people around the world, a sort of living ghost of a system of rapacious and bloodthirsty extraction. Do you agree with those sentiments?
Well,
or can you understand why?
I certainly understand them. I think the statement is somewhat polemical, but I can appreciate where he's coming from.
Why do some Brits, Boris Johnson to name one, express nostalgia for the empire?
Well, I mean, in some sense, why not? I mean, the empire was, from their perspective, the point at which Britain was at its height, at its glory. From their perspective, it must seem dismaying that Britain has shrunk, not just in size, but in power and prestige and wealth.
You could also say it's better off without its empire.
I think most people would feel that way. And I think, for example, today, most people look at Russia and its attempt to sort of reclaim part of its empire and see this as a foolish and bloodthirsty decision.
Some people say that former colonies would be better off with the British back in business. I mean, this is out there. How do you respond to that?
Oh, yes, it is out there.
Take Zimbabwe, for instance, which has been a hellish place since it won its independence under Mugabe in 1980 or so. But I don't agree with that sentiment. Right? Mm-hmm. Colonialism is a nasty, bloody, immoral business. But these ideas are out there.
Yes, they're out there. And my question is, what do you propose to do here? I mean, it is true that some of these countries have had difficult post-independence existences. But, there are plenty of other countries in the West, for example, that have had troubles as well.
Yeah, I heard the United States fought a civil war.
Germany was seen as one of the most civilized countries in the world until it wasn't with the rise of the Nazis. I mean, these problems occur across the board.
What do you make of this debate? It's not surprising, but it is still depressing, at least to me, that we can't have nuanced discussions, balanced discussions when someone like the Queen dies, that it either has to be all good or all bad. I mean, because there have been some really nasty.
Yes, there have.
Yeah. I mean, there was that one professor at Carnegie Mellon basically cheering the Queen's death. I mean, that's a little too much.
I agree.
Yes, a lot too much.
Well, I mean, it really is a reflection of the polarization that exists in our country today, and in Britain, for that matter. This sense that you're either for or against, you have to take extreme positions. It's reinforced, of course, by social media, and it can be pretty dismaying.
What about the monarchy? Some Brits want the monarchy to go or just have a reduced role in public life, especially when considering how much wealth they have, and there's been issues with them not paying taxes or getting some type of break that normal people, we peons, would not get. Right. What is your view on the monarchy and its future?
If you're asking, am I predicting whether the monarchy will come to an end, I would say probably not. I think that there's simply far too much support for it, despite the fact that Charles isn't the beloved figure that Elizabeth was. Now, whether the monarchy should exist is another matter, but that's not for me to decide. The Americans, I'm an American, we decided that issue in 1776. Right. It's something for the British to decide. If they want to keep the monarchy, well,
what do you think of the debate they're having? Because, the royal family seems to be better liked here than it is in some quarters. I mean, there were some protesters who got arrested when the Queen's coffin was being brought to its final destination, and there was a backlash about the arrests. What are your views on that debate?
It's a debate that waxes and wanes over time, depending on circumstances. I mean, one can even look back to the mid-19th century under the reign of Queen Victoria, who was seen as, sort of this exemplar of successful monarchy. But there was a period of about a decade or so when she was intensely disliked and Republican sentiments were really quite strong. It doesn't surprise me in the least that the Republican sentiments have become more vocal with the death of Elizabeth and the succession of Charles. But my guess is, again, that's, Charles has an immense group of public relations specialists and others who are going to do their best to dampen down those sentiments.
And he also is known to stick his nose in politics, too, which he's not supposed to be doing.
He has. It'll be interesting to see whether he will adopt his mother's more restrained role. I suspect he will, now that he's become king.
Well, I find this whole thing about nobility, as an American, to be a little bit strange. The accident of blood in birth, and we're supposed to genuflect.
Hereditary right. Yeah, I mean,
it's ridiculous.
It's a very archaic notion, yes. And the fact that these people have immense wealth, much more wealth than we know anything.
And often stolen. I mean, I didn't even bring up some of the issues that have arisen since the Queen died. Some of the jewels, right, were essentially taken, maybe stolen from the countries who now want them back.
Right. The British Museum is a reservoir of loot from the empire, right? The Benin bronzes and the like. So, yeah, these are important issues that I think they're going to have to address, but that doesn't mean that they're going to.
Not to sound unkind, but I think it's a bit disgusting. Anyway, we'll wrap up here. Empire is a touchy subject. The idea of one group of people dominating another. So many of the scholars I've had on my podcast would say, the United States is not an empire. Mm-hmm. And I would say, not like the British, the French, the Belgian, the Dutch, those empires that were swept away, as we've been discussing after the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. We've already been talking enough here about the British Empire. Any final thoughts on this question, which I think is really important to American society right now, as we're dealing with, a 20-year failed war in Afghanistan, and the next year will be the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, and whether the United States is an empire, and if so, what does that mean?
I think empires come in various forms, and the empires that were created by European states from the 15th century onward were what we would call colonial empires.
The United States is not a colonizer.
It is not a colonial empire. I think, however, yes, it is an empire. It possesses that kind of power to influence and shape and determine the affairs of other peoples around the world in a way that empires do.
That's right. Even if some of these agreements are voluntary or not coerced, we do have our bases all over the world because...
Over 100 of them.
Yes. Or actually, I think it's more like 800, isn't it?
800, yeah. I think you're right. That's right.
Yeah,
sorry.
800 bases in the world because, all right, maybe it was a voluntary, but, who's holding the upper hand in the negotiations?
Absolutely.
And, I want to amend something I actually just said about us not being colonizers. Overseas, yes, with the exception of the Philippines maybe in the late 19th century. But the North American Empire, the continental empire, was colonized by white European settlers who became Americans.
That is certainly true. And even overseas, I mean, we still have some residues of an empire, Guam, and one could argue Puerto Rico and certain other territories.
Here in Washington, D.C., we don't have representation. All right, let's not go there. Dane Kennedy, thank you.
My pleasure.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, as the war in Ukraine has been raging for months now, I've been wondering, where is the UN? Can the United Nations stop this war? Has the UN ever been able to stop wars involving a major power? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.